Well, I don't think it's going to calm the region down at all. I think it will trigger a greater response, of course, in South Korea and in the U.S. I think we'll see louder voices from those who have been advocating a more robust response to North Korea's growing military capabilities and nuclear threat.
We will be coming back to that conversation in just a few moments. This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. North Korea tells the South to watch out. Japan continues increasing its presence on the world stage, and the recovery efforts in Nepal. These stories and more are on the May 15th edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, my name is Steve Miller, your host. It's my pleasure to be here, so thank you so much for taking time out of your week to join me. Now, last weekend, North Korea rattled its sabers once more. The KCNA said North Korea would fire upon and attack any South Korean naval vessel if it crossed the northern limit line. The DPRK also launched 3 submarine-based ballistic missiles. Putting this all into context is Daniel Pinkston, Crisis Group's Senior Analyst and Northeast Asia Deputy Project Director, who explains that this isn't the first time North Korea has made threats like this.
Well, in 1999, they issued a statement regarding a military demarcation line extended into the Yellow Sea. The Armistice Agreement in 1953 did not provide for any maritime boundaries. So it's basically been undefined. Shortly after the armistice was signed, I think about 6 months after, unilaterally, the U.S. general at that time and his staff, they drew this Northern Limit Line, or NLL, which now the South interprets that or claims that's a maritime boundary between North and South Korea. And it went unchallenged until the 70s, early 70s, when North Korea began to challenge it. They don't recognize it. And then in 1999, they announced their own line. And there's an area that's quite significant that is disputed, where the two sides claim those waters as their territorial waters. So anyone can make claims about waters or territory, but then it becomes a question of whether or not you wish to enforce those claims and if you're going to attempt to enforce those claims. So as North Korea has acquired more capabilities, this question comes up what they're going to do about it and if they're going to use force to enforce those claims. So that's what's worrisome. And they made a threat to enforce those asserted claims. There have been skirmishes in that area. There have been shootouts and there have been casualties and loss of life in that area. In the past, it was a big gun battle in 99, and then 2002, and then 2009. Then many people believe that the sinking of the Cheonan in 2010 was a response, retaliation for a battle in late 2009, where the North Koreans took quite a beating. And the North Koreans fired first, according to reports, and then the South retaliated quite heavily and nearly sunk one of their naval vessels, and they had to tow it back into port. And then I think it motivated the North Koreans to seek revenge, and I think that was one of the big motivations behind the sinking of the Cheonan in March. And then, of course, we had the shelling of Yeongjang-do later in that year. So this area is an area of dispute, high tension, and there are also economic resources in the area, fisheries, stocks, resources on the seabed and in the water. A lot of fishing boats are out there. So that's an area of contention as well and can always trigger a flare-up. And this time, right now, is a busy crab fishing season, so that could contribute to some problems out there as well.
If we turn our attention to the East Coast, over the weekend there was a report of 3 submarine-based missiles being launched. The United States already said that was a violation of UN Security Council sanctions. How is this launch going to affect North Korea's relationship with the South, with the United States, and other regional partners like China or Russia?
Well, I don't think it's going to calm the region down at all. I think it will trigger a greater response, of course, in South Korea and in the U.S. I think we'll see louder voices from those who have been advocating a more robust response to North Korea's growing military capabilities and nuclear threat. South Korea has been quite divided recently. There have been public debates about what kinds of missile defense should be deployed, debates about military spending and budgets and R&D and procurement and what kind of systems should be deployed, how should the alliance with the U.S. be structured, and how should training go to respond to all of these things. So there are a lot of details in the military response towards North Korea. And this test of a submarine-launched ballistic missile on Friday, I think, is really going to energize those who have been arguing for a more robust response. So I think we'll see some accelerated expenditures and R&D and deployments of systems, counter-strike systems, intelligence collection, also missile defense and other types of systems. I think you'll see more anti-submarine warfare assets and training and combined training with the U.S. I just don't see how the neighbors can sit around and do nothing. I think it'll be a big shock in Tokyo as well. So I think you'll see a military response, a buildup of a deterrent posture, and we'll watch and see how that unfolds in the coming months and years.
What do you think we'll see next from North Korea and regional countries? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook and Twitter. And coming up later in the podcast, the latest from Nepal. South Korea and China may not like it, but Japan is continuing to emerge as a major player on the world stage, increasingly stepping further away from its pacifist constitution. First, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is moving ahead this week with legislation that could boost the military's international role. The LDP reached a formal agreement this week to expand the military's role, something that, given the current situation in the South China Sea, is sorely needed. The changes will then head to Parliament for a final ratification. Gone would be the geographic restrictions, operational conditions, and it would also allow for the SDF to assist allies on peacekeeping missions. This marks a turning point in which Japan moves away from the traditional isolationism, where Japan doesn't contribute too much to international security, to a more cooperative, proactive internationalism, said security analyst Narushige Mitsushita at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. To that end, Japan and the Philippines announced last weekend they would hold joint military drills in the South China Sea. 2 warships from Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force would participate in the exercise, as well as a single Philippine vessel, said Vice Admiral Jesus Milan. Now, Milan stressed this had absolutely nothing to do with the territorial disputes in the South China Sea with China, but merely an opportunity for the 2 naval forces to compare notes. Earlier this month, the 2 countries also held anti-piracy drills, making that the first opportunity the 2 had participated in war games since the end of World War II. The Prime Minister isn't only thinking locally. Abe is continuing to push his reform for the United Nations Security Council and vie for a permanent seat on that council for Japan. The Yomiuri Shimbun is reporting the plan that may be submitted to the United Nations would include the following: increasing from 5 the permanent seated members to 11, increasing from 10 to 14 or 15 the non-permanent members. 1 or 2 additional African nation seats would also be given to the council. New permanent members wouldn't have veto powers for 15 years. Also, the Asian region would be renamed the Asia-Pacific region, and the Latin America area would be changed to Latin America and the Caribbean. Security Council reforms required the support of 2/3 of the 193 current UN members, or 129 votes, for a plan to be adopted by the UN General Assembly. Then that's sent to the Security Council, where it needs a 2/3 vote. Say what you will about Japan and its revisionist history, the plans being put forward are sound and have a benefit not only for Japan, but the entire region as a whole. The only thing I would actually like to see in Japan's proposal that isn't there is a ban on the veto for all permanent members when it comes to humanitarian considerations. Such a rule would prohibit situations like we're facing right now with China and possibly Russia stepping in and protecting North Korea from human rights abuses. Now, later in the podcast, why some in Hong Kong are calling the Beijing plan for the election of the chief executive in 2017 fake democracy. Another massive earthquake struck Nepal this week. It was a magnitude 7.4 that rocked not only Nepal, but parts of Bangladesh as well. The U.S. Geological Survey pegged the epicenter 22 kilometers southeast of Xi'an, China. Reuters News reports that the quake struck near the base camp of Mount Everest and measured a shallow depth of only 10 kilometers. Recovery efforts continue from the initial quake, where over 8,000 people have died, and this latest jolt isn't helping matters, as more deaths have been reported. But the waves of destruction are only part of the problem relief workers are facing. Only a portion of the aid requested by the United Nations has made its way into the country, officials said late last week. At one point, out of the $415 million requested, only a little over $22 million had been provided. It is a poor response, said Orla Fagan, spokeswoman for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, in an interview with Reuters News. She attributed the poor international response to donor fatigue, as there have been several other major international disasters warranting assistance. Jamie McGoldrick, the UN's chief official in Nepal, said donations for the humanitarian efforts need to be dramatically ramped up. McGoldrick said relief personnel are now working so that people have roofs over their heads and their other urgent needs are addressed before the monsoon season starts, which usually begins in June and could trigger additional mudslides. Authorities are also reporting that 260 government health facilities have been completely destroyed, with another 500 damaged. Thankfully, some of the larger private hospitals have been cleared to resume normal operation. Sadly, in some areas, relief is hard to come by. In Banskarka, every house was destroyed and little aid has arrived. Relief workers are turning to monasteries for tents in an effort to provide temporary shelter for survivors. Over 300,000 tents have already been distributed, but they need over 600,000 to fulfill requests. The pictures that continue to come in truly tug on the heartstrings. One official said that while pledging support is important, the other piece of the puzzle, and rightly so, is actually following through and sending in the money you pledge. So please, follow up and do that. Now, what else is happening in the region? A roundup of stories you may have missed is coming up. For 2 months, pro-democracy advocates took to the streets of Hong Kong. They rallied for true universal suffrage. It was a measure Beijing didn't support and ultimately clamped down and forced the protesters to vacate. Before Hong Kong's Legislative Council is a plan supported by Beijing to allow Hong Kong citizens the opportunity to vote, but some are calling the measure a fake democracy.
Well, because those candidates who are deemed unacceptable to Beijing and the power elites will not be allowed to stand for election.
That's Emily Lau, chairperson of the Democratic Party, speaking on the phone from Hong Kong.
So they can get in the first round and even take part in some fake televised debates. And then there will be a vote by the Committee of 1,200 worthies, and then they will vote and allow 2 or 3 candidates to be nominated. So this is really a very, very, I think, very, very offensive process, a screening process, whereby those deemed unacceptable to Beijing definitely will not have a chance of being nominated.
Well, let me ask you this. A lot of discussion has been taking place on who can run, for example. But how are the members of the nominating committee actually chosen, who actually have the ultimate stopgate power to deem who is acceptable and who is not acceptable to run for the chief executive?
These are mainly the business, professional, and the political elites. Most of them belong to the so-called functional constituencies created by the British in 1985. And so these are business people and the professional people who work for them and work with them, and some of the political people appointed by Beijing. And also, of course, include all the legislative councillors and a number of district councillors. But the vast majority of the people in this committee have close political and commercial ties with Beijing, and they will, of course, follow the orders of Beijing.
That is just a portion of the conversation. You'll be able to hear the rest in its entirety tomorrow on Asia Now. And now for a quick look at some other regional news. Human Rights Watch released a report this week noting Chinese police still rely heavily on confessions, sometimes extracted through torture, because they lack the staffing to properly investigate crimes. The report says that while interrogations do take place in front of video cameras, police officers often take prisoners off camera for torture. Human Rights Watch says the suspects may be shackled, strapped to chairs, hung by their wrists, and deprived of food and water while being questioned. Records reviewed by the organization found that out of 1.16 million cases tried in 2013, only 825 defendants were acquitted. The report also says defendants rarely have access to lawyers, family members, or doctors unconnected to the police to help prove their innocence. The wife of jailed Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim won a seat in a by-election last week. Anwar's family has had a seat in the government for decades and is a sign that his supporters haven't waned. Prime Minister Najib and his ruling party have been under fire as of late for their use of the Sedition Act, prompting longtime former leader Mahathir Mohamad to call for Najib to step down. Last week also saw calls for a public referendum on Thailand's draft charter. It was something that Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha didn't think was needed. Some assert that a public referendum would be a good way to gauge public support for the document, especially since the charter was sent to the people in 2007, so failing to do so now could be viewed as a step backwards. One other thing to consider would be what happens if the people reject this current charter. Do they revise an older document or simply start anew? The U.S. Defense Department revealed that China's total land reclamation area in the South China Sea has quadrupled over the past 4 months and expressed concern. The DoD now estimates that roughly 8 square kilometers have been reclaimed, up from just 2 this past December. The Defense Department calls what China is doing akin to building a Great Wall of Sand. Also this past week, The Diplomat ran a piece that echoed my thoughts from last week's podcast that we could actually see U.S. naval forces up their presence in the area as a way to try and deter China's efforts. The DoD report also said that China often uses a progression of steps to increase its effective control over disputed territories and avoid escalation to military conflict. It also noted that a growing number of U.S. bases in Japan are within missile range. And finally, another blogger was killed by machete-wielding attackers in Bangladesh on Tuesday. Anata Bijoy Das, a blogger who advocated secularism, was attacked by 4 assailants Tuesday morning, the senior police official told Reuters News. Das was 33 years old and was also the editor of the science magazine Jukti, which means logic, and also on the advisory board for Mukto Mona, meaning free mind, a website propagating rationalism and opposing fundamentalism that was founded by U.S.-based blogger Avijit Roy, who unfortunately was killed this past February. Roy's widow said she would not be surprised if more bloggers were targeted because the killers know they can get away with it. This, meaning the killings, were becoming serial. And that is just a look at some of the other stories from this week. I'll have more on Sunday's Patreon exclusive podcast, as well as next week on the Asia Brief. All right, my friends, the podcast is winding down, but before I go, let's take a quick look at some of your comments. First up, Douglas Stingley wrote, "It's now futile to avoid war. I lived in China. I know the government's attitude. The USA will have to move in. We're the only nation powerful enough. Check our naval presence in the area. We know the future." Japanese columnist wrote, "Big difference between Japan in the old times and China in the present time is the circumstance. There were Western nations to encounter Japan in Asia, but now there is almost nobody to give political pressure on China." Cruz Christian sent in a great email, and here's just a portion of it. Although I think I'm trying to be as objective as possible, as a disclaimer, I have to say that my wife is Chinese, therefore half of my family is in that country. United States of America is the biggest manufacturer of weapons in the world and has the most powerful armed forces. Its international policy can be adequately called new imperialist. Why is it that every time China does these kinds of things, it's called an imperialistic attitude that must be stopped? And when the United States does the same, and much, very, very much worse, it's called liberator, defender of democracy, freedom fighter, and similar. I frankly do not get it. Maurice Fawcett wrote, "It was probably inevitable that Japan would eventually break away from its pacifist restrictions imposed on it by the United States. It's rather unrealistic to expect an independent country not to maintain some kind of military, and in Japan's situation, they need to be more assertive." Thank you again, everyone who took the time out to leave a comment on this week's podcast. I truly do appreciate it. And I hope that if you have an opinion on any of the stories covered in today's podcast or any of the other podcasts I release throughout the week, that you'll take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook, Twitter, or shoot me an email. Now, before I go, I do need to make a program note. I'll be busy this next week traveling and attending an international conference here in Seoul, so there won't be an Asia Brief next Monday. In fact, the only podcast next week will be Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday with the Asia Brief. No Asia News Weekly next Friday or Asia Now next Saturday, and podcasts should hopefully return to normal on Tuesday, the 26th of April, following the Buddha's birthday holiday here in South Korea. To keep up with more news from the region, please follow Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your questions, your comments, and your feedback. That email address is podcast@asianewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. It's absolutely free and easy to do. You can do that on our website, asianewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application, like iTunes or Stitcher. When you do subscribe, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. Well, my friends, that's all the time I have today. My name is Steve Miller, and please, be true to yourself and always be awesome.